and welcome to the first episode of the Tom Talks podcast with myself, Tom Randall. Today, I talk with Jeremy Roberts about right-wing populism in the United States. Jeremy is a good friend of mine, and I'm greatly appreciative of him to join me for the first go at this podcast. We met at Western University, starting our PhDs in political science at the same time. Jeremy's doctoral research investigates the rise of populism in the United States, and our conversation ranges from pinning down how to define populism, the significance of voter perception of the political landscape independent of statistics, and understanding Donald Trump's success. As this podcast will give testament to, Jeremy has a wealth of knowledge. I have heard more than one person refer to him as a walking encyclopedia. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from Western University and a master's degree from Oxford University. Let me give a quick note on the podcast's audio before beginning. Jeremy and myself did our talk using FaceTime audio, and while some editing has removed most of the problems associated with recording a phone call, I apologise if some sound issues remain. I am not a professional sound editor, but I hope to improve these skills in coming episodes. So, without further ado, I give you Jeremy. With me, I have Jeremy Roberts. Jeremy, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Tom. It's an honor.
You are a PhD candidate in political science at Western. How do you understand the particular branch of political science that you work in and the specific research that you're engaging with in that regard?
Basically, political science is the search for generalizable truth about how people make decisions. So I guess I see my role, just like a biologist wants to figure out, fundamental truth about biological life in the world, I should say. I want to figure out fundamental truth in so much as it's possible about the political world that we all live in. And so the research that I'm doing right now, that I'm in the process of conducting, has to do with the determinants of populist success in the American context. And so what I hope to produce eventually is some sort of an explanation for why populists find success in the United States.
So when we talk about American context, are we talking about the past 10 years? Or if we're talking about a truth, how are we describing that over a period of time?
So how am I bounding it? That's a fair question, right? Because, for those of you listening to this who have some background in the study of populism in the United States, you know that it's not a new thing. It's been around for a very long time. In fact, there was a successful party called the Populist Party that ran more than 100 years ago. One of their candidates, William Jennings Bryan, very famous man. Incidentally, he also was involved in the Scopes monkey trial in the 1920s, but neither here nor there for this podcast. And they were mostly an agrarian group, right? It was like farmer-based populism. And today, what we're seeing in the United States is a resurgence in a different kind of populism. So what I'm really looking at is sort of right-wing populists. Less on the grassroots left-wing side, so less of the Bernie Sanders stuff, more the Donald Trump stuff, if that makes any sense. And through the mid-'90s, you also had Ross Perot. Before him, you had Pat Buchanan, who actually ran a very similar campaign to Donald Trump in terms of the content of his message, but was obviously a lot less successful. And then going back about to the late 1960s, where you had George Wallace, who ran sort of an insurgent populist campaign within the Democratic primary, I believe. There was actually, I think in the late 1960s, early 1970s, there was since I'm focusing on the Republican primary contest, right, so not the general election, but the actual selection of the Republican nominee for president, there was a fundamental change in the rules in the late 1960s and early 1970s that means before that period, any information that I'm able to produce about the determinants of success in that context wouldn't necessarily apply because the system changed sufficiently to render a lot of that irrelevant, if that makes sense.
So why focus on the primaries and not the election itself?
For sure, yeah. No, there are two reasons for that. One is that the presidential election has been the subject of much navel-gazing already. The other thing is that party loyalty does not explain why someone like Donald Trump would win the nomination, even if it does go a long way to explaining why he could actually win the presidency. So the fact that he openly railed against the Republican establishment and still won the nomination is very interesting. And also the fact that the data are really good at the county level. But those are the main reasons that I picked it. Basically, you have this similar group of candidates across a wide geographical area with lots of data points at the county level. I think almost 30 million people voted in the primary election, which is more than vote in most countries' elections.
Yeah.
So it's very robust, and I think it's fascinating too because it's a marked departure from who the Republicans nominated last two cycles, right? In 2012, they selected Mitt Romney, who is a consummate insider, whereas but in 2008, they nominated John McCain, who'd been in the Senate for decades, right? Then in 2016, they said, no, we're going to take this guy who has the least experience of any person nominated by a major party that I can think of.
So, Jeremy, before we go any further then, I suppose we need to pin down an answer to perhaps the most obvious question here, which is, how are you defining populism? What is it in your mind that links the disparate politics of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump underneath this umbrella term of populism?
So populism is bandied about so frequently in the popular media, and really everywhere, that it's tough to actually make head or tail of it, right? Because so many different people with so many diverse political opinions and views have been labeled populist. So I actually have a list in front of me because I anticipated this coming up. And so Donald Trump obviously has been called a populist, but so is Jesse Jackson. Geert Wilders of the Netherlands, Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, Emmanuel Macron, current president of France, Ross Perot, the pro-systems billionaire who ran for president in 1992 and 1996. Even Mitt Romney has actually been called a populist before.
So what links all of these people together then? It can't just be that they're popular, because any person could be a populist in that sense who comes to power. So I just wonder what it is.
Well, for sure. So actually, there's a really convenient sort of pithy summation of the concept of populism offered by a former Ecuadorian president named Abdallah Bucaram, who said, it's one ideology against the oligarchy. Right. That was the entirety of his political world, was just opposing the oligarchy. And this other political scientist, a guy named Kenneth Roberts, who no relation, although he's very intelligent, so sometimes I wish there was. He says the essential core of populism is understood to be the political mobilization of mass constituencies by personalistic leaders who challenge established elites, right? So basically what unites all of those people is the fact that they're not a big fan of what they perceive to be an entrenched elite, and they hope to personify the masses in opposition to that elite. And sometimes it's successful and sometimes it's not. There's a variety of reasons why different scholars postulate that it would be successful or wouldn't be.
The general umbrella of populism then is, and I like the succinctness of the first quote you gave, that's against the oligarchy, or at least challenges the elites. And we've heard bounded about the term establishment and anti-establishment politics. So the anti-establishment then comes under the populist umbrella. And I suppose any kind of movement that wants to call itself populist must at least identify an establishment to challenge.
What really matters is not so much a clear and concise definition of establishment, right? Like, there's a reason, so I'll change the subject a little bit. There's a reason that populist parties don't do so well once they're in office, because they really need to have somebody to rail against. And when they're the people in charge, the elites are controlling everything, doesn't work, which is why you've seen the emergence of the term the deep state, because once you're in power, all the problems all of a sudden fall on your shoulders. And if you're a populist, right, and an anti-establishment insider, and that's the source of your legitimacy, you have to come up with a new establishment basically to attack. I guess what matters most, at least in what I've seen in the secondary research that I've done, is a perception among your electorate that there is an establishment, or that the existing political order is ineffective in some way or another. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that there's a cabal, a group of people sitting around a table at the Republican National Committee's headquarters and plotting something. But if people have a vague idea that maybe there is, then you're good to go.
So when we talk about the idea that you, as a populist, as soon as you get into government, you now become the new establishment, is that it? Because you have no choice. In other words, you have to set out your own agenda. And so is there an irony that a populist movement cannot really become a government, because as soon as you get into government, you are the new establishment. Could that be said?
When I was presenting this topic in public, one of the attendees basically said, well, you're going to encounter a problem, right? Because if you talk about the Republican establishment, the new Republican establishment is, Donald Trump, despite the fact that he built his political reputation on attacking the establishment. Now he is the establishment. And so that's confusing when you want to talk to voters about it, right? So, do you think Donald Trump is opposed to the Republican establishment? If I were to ask that in a survey, people would be confused because, well, now he is the president, the de facto leader of the party. That's always been how the role of the president is understood in American party politics. And so, yeah, no, it's certainly a problem.
Yeah, I suppose, populists generally, I suppose, especially for Trump and the public eye, who hasn't really done too much to cast out the establishment thus far.
Well, so he's an interesting guy, and I don't want to get too much into the weeds about the specific case of post-presidential Donald Trump, right? After he won the election. But I will say this: I will say that he has populated his staff with an interesting mix of insiders and outsiders. So, the consummate outsider would be someone like Steve Bannon, who spent ages at Breitbart railing against the Republican elite, the Republican establishment, and he's the president's chief strategist. But then people like Reince Priebus or Sean Spicer, they're Republican Party insiders, and they have been for a very long time. Before he took the job of chief of staff, Reince Priebus was head of the Republican National Committee, which is Republicans as a party, right? And you're the unelected head of the Republican Party, essentially. And so that's what he did before. So Donald Trump hasn't cast them out completely, but he has had some sort of unconventional picks along for other positions. So to answer that, I would say that he has hired on a lot of prominent establishment figures into his administration, but he's also hired on a bunch of people who are less experienced with traditional formal DC politics. So his strategist, Steve Bannon, is an editor for a long time, like a political operative, but not really a Republican establishment kind of person. Stephen Miller, same thing. He's actually quite young, he's in his early 30s. But then people like Reince Priebus and Sean Spicer come from the Republican National Committee and have a fair amount of actual Republican political experience. And then a lot of people in the Trump administration, from what I understand, have previous backgrounds working in Washington in some capacity or another. Well, a lot don't. Like Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was former head of Exxon, the oil giant, so he sort of comes from outside of politics. But I mean, Trump dangled that sweet fruit of the Secretary of State ship in front of a whole lot of establishment political figures before he eventually did give it to Tillerson.
Is there a distinction between a political establishment and, say, a business establishment that are in close cohorts with the political, such as the oil giants that you mentioned?
So I think that for sure there is. I think that a lot of the rhetoric, especially on the populist left, sort of conflates the wealthy with the powerful. So when you hear Bernie Sanders talking about, the millionaires and the billionaires and how they're buying off members of Congress and they're donating huge sums of money to super PACs or the Koch brothers, another set of brothers who are famous both for their podcast appearances and their significant contributions to conservative causes. They are, I think, conflated with the political establishment. Functionally, some people are more influential than others, but the way the U.S. political game is played today, in large part because of Citizens United, but even before then, it's high dollar fundraisers with wealthy individuals. So you're going to get the ear of the president one way or another if you are a prominent enough donor. So I think that it's probably fair to make the claim that the wealthy establishment are part and parcel with the political establishment.
So this is very interesting. So is it a language game? Or?
I suppose it's language. It's mostly like a perception game, like a political, right. Like how the candidate in question positions him or herself in relation to his competition or her competition in the leadership race or in a presidential campaign, and how voters, like, whether or not they buy that. Like I'll say this: when people run for high political office in the United States, nobody's going to get up there and say, I am a member of the Republican establishment. That's not a winning ticket. Right. What it really comes down to is, yes, you say, I'm going to drain the swamp I'm going to get all the lobbyists out of Washington. I'm going to bring power back to the people. That's a quote that you could attribute to anybody who's running for office. They've all said something like that in some form or another. What really matters is, based on their rhetoric, based on their actions, based on their past behavior, based on their resume, do the people that they're trying to appeal to believe them?
Right, and so you can quite straightforwardly then make the connection between language and perceptions. So the way that you want the labels that you want to be associated with almost create the political reality. Let's then take a step back again. So is there a consistent economic theory that populists like to espouse?
The populists that I'm interested in, those on the right, they tend to, and there's actually an excellent book written in the mid-1990s on this topic, but basically the authors, Herbert Kitchell and Anthony McGann, they came up with what they called a winning formula, right, which was populist parties had to have a certain amount of nativist line to capture some of their constituency, and they also had to adopt a free market tone, so think neoliberal economics, like lower taxes and whatnot, to capture another part of their potential electorate. And so on the right, populists tend to adopt fairly right-wing positions on a lot of that stuff, although they are distinguishable from conservative parties, traditional conservative parties in other ways. So there tends to be more of an emphasis on issues like immigration, for example. But, there have been a few, well, I wouldn't say probably even more than a few, but there's been a fair amount of association made between certain modes of economics. Is that the right word? Modes of economics, but certain economic theories, let's say, or certain economic principles and the concept of populism. Probably the most common one is import substitution industrialization. So in Latin America, especially, where a lot of the literature on populism was developed, a lot of scholars of populism write about Latin America because Latin America has a rich populist tradition. Juan Perón all the way up to Hugo Chavez, Rafael Correa of Ecuador, and a lot of them over the years have espoused that this import substitution industrialization economic idea, which is basically instead of buying things from other countries, you make them in your own country, whether or not it makes sense economically for you to do so, but you do it for political reasons. And so that's something that's long been associated with populism because it's a crowd pleaser, right?
When you get a crowd mobilized by a populist, a lot of it does come from their persona, how they react with the crowd. They talk, and if it meshes with the crowd, if the crowd gets quite fired up by it, they just do more of that.
Well, populism is about speaking for an otherwise non-represented majority. So you're saying, in order for populists to be successful, a lot of the literature suggests that the existing political system can't provide an outlet, basically, for the views of a significant portion of the population. So, if both the left and the right offer options that are palatable to enough of the population, there wouldn't be a need for a populist to emerge and say, no, they're doing it wrong, I can fix it. A big part of the rhetoric offered by populists has to do with, there's a majority out there and I'm just tapping into it like I am the people, right?
Right, and so it does take a personality to bring the rhetoric to life, though. So
for sure.
If you're standing in front of the crowd in a monotone, dreary sense, rather than firing up the crowd, you see Trump doing his rallies. And it takes a certain skill, not to give too much to the man, but it takes a certain skill to confront a crowd without pre-written scripts, as he seems to do.
Well, I think Donald Trump, of all the people who've run for president in modern history, I think he actually enjoyed it the most.
Yeah.
He's got a gift for that. So I don't think it's necessarily controversial to suggest that he certainly can work a room. And the way I sort of incorporated that, what you're suggesting, into my analysis of populism has to do with the ability for them to own issues, right, and the ability for them to generate media that drives the conversation towards issues that they're perceived to be the most competent to handle. So there was a study that came out not too long ago. I think it might have come out before he actually won the presidency, but it was about during the primary process, about how much free media he actually got. So in politics, the jargoning term for that is earned media. So when you do something and the news covers you and you don't have to pay for it, that's earning media. And Donald Trump got billions and billions of dollars in earned media, dwarfing any other candidate, just by virtue of the fact that he had that star power and he had that appeal. I don't know how many times I watched CNN and I saw them just filming an empty podium, just waiting for him to come out.
Yeah, because I suppose again because he had that aura that made people want to know what he was going to say, so he almost had them in the palm of his hand.
My hunch, and I haven't verified this with data, but my hunch is that has to do with the fact that he was able to successfully paint himself as the person who is most qualified to deal with the basis issues on a variety of topics. So, like immigration, for example. He sort of started that conversation on immigration, and because he was a celebrity, because he had all that media attention, he was able to beat it into people's heads that he is the person who is most qualified to handle the immigration issue.
So why didn't Donald Trump stand as an independent then, do you think? Or do you think just because there was a party there, it was just easier to latch onto it?
Basically, I would suggest that if you are a conservative-leaning candidate and you want to run for president, and the Republican Party also nominates someone, what you would end up doing is splitting the right-leaning vote enough that you would almost certainly guarantee the victory of a person whose policy outcome is less favorable to you than the Republican candidates would have been in general.
Right. So it's a tactical move then.
Mm-hmm. I think that the prospects of success for an independent party would be limited. And I know, we can look at other political systems where they're more proportional, so where the actual percentage of votes dictates percentage of seats held in the legislature. So, where a party gets 40% of the vote, they get 40% of the seats, right? You end up getting a lot more parties because people know that they can vote for pretty much whoever they want, and their vote will actually ideally be reflected in the makeup of parliament. Yeah. I suppose if you had enough ideological diversity, it could work. But I'm fairly confident that in the United States system, a three-party system, unless they were perfectly balanced on one of the polls and each had 33% of the popular vote typically, and that popular vote was spread appropriately to make them electorally viable, I'm fairly certain that it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for a third party to emerge. I mean, there is an interesting test case of this, and again, it's not something that I focus on necessarily, but if you look at Utah last cycle, Utah has a large religious population, and there are a lot of Mormons out there. And a lot of the things that Donald Trump said, and part of his personal history, is not compatible, so shall we say, with a lot of the sincerely held beliefs of the more devout Mormons. And so a candidate emerged there, a guy named Evan McMullen, and I believe he actually was able to take more than 20% of the vote statewide between him, Trump, and Hillary, but Trump still won. So It's interesting, but I think that he ran within the system because it afforded him the best chance of actually winning the presidency, right?
So we've got a very good background about what populism is, I think, and the particular branch of populism you're going to be looking at. What do you expect to find in pursuing that research?
So my first hypothesis can be summarized as support for populists, and in my case, I'm operationalizing that as support for Donald Trump in a Republican primary or caucus vote, is predicated on the assumption that the two main parties, so the Democrats and the Republicans, offer more of the same, and so that voting for an establishment Republican is functionally equivalent to voting for a Democrat in terms of the voter getting his or her ideology expressed by a politician. So, they've converged. There's one political theorist, she's Belgian, her name's Chantal Mouffe, and she talks about the main parties now are like Pepsi and Coke. There's a slight variation, but not enough for it to matter. The second hypothesis actually has to do with belief among this population, independently of actual data. So a lot of things that are typically thought to trigger populist support. Crime, for example. Like, you'll remember Donald Trump's inaugural address where he talked about American carnage. He painted a very dark view of the United States, a very dark picture that's not actually backed up by statistics about crime. Crime has been consistently dropping for many years, but as a populist, crime is a very convenient mobilizing issue.
Also, like the interview Newt Gingrich gave, where
absolutely, yes.
How did that go? That the interviewer asked him, why are you talking about this when crime figures have actually gone down?
The reporter reminded him that violent crime had actually gone down after Newt Gingrich. This was on CNN after he had, I think it was CNN, after he had said it was rising, the reporter said, no, it's going down. And Trump actually dismissed the FBI statistics that the reporter brought up, and he said, that's your view, and the current view is that liberals have a whole set of statistics which theoretically may be right, but it's not where human beings are. Right. So in other words, basically what he was saying was Americans feel less safe, and that's what matters, than whether or not crime has actually gone up, right?
That's right.
So it's this perception. So the second thing I expect to see is sort of a divorce from reality. And that sounds harsh, and I don't mean that, as a normative judgment. It's just there are things that are typically thought to trigger populist support, and my argument is that whether or not they're actually changing, it should be that people still think they are. And that is also the convergence issue, right? So one of the puzzles I'm looking at solving and unraveling, hopefully, the fact that we'll see convergence, like the convergence between the main parties, is considered by some scholars to be a necessity for populist success. But in the United States, differentiation has gone way up, right? So how do you square that circle? And I think it has to do with this perception of convergence. So whether or not the parties are the same, the fact that some people think they're the same, or that some people think they are functionally similar enough that voting for a Republican would not solve my problem in the same way voting for a Democrat would not solve my problem. Therefore, I need a third person to vote for. I think that's the explanation for this rise. And then the third hypothesis, right? So the third thing that I'm looking for is once populist support has been generated, success comes from the ability of the candidate in question to actually push the electorate towards issues that he or she is perceived as the most qualified to handle, right? So the ability to set the agenda and control the conversation. So when all three of these things happen, so when everybody believes that both parties are functionally similar, and the rhetoric about issues that concern people is actually divorced from reality about those issues, and when candidates can set the agenda and discuss issues that they actually care about, that's when you get populist success, right? So those are the three hypotheses that I'm going to explore, ideally, in this research.
Right, Jamie, that's hugely interesting. Obviously, I wish you best of luck in your research, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Tom. It's been a pleasure.
To keep up to date with the Tom Talks podcast, subscribe to Tom Talks on iTunes and YouTube, follow the podcast on Twitter at Tom Talks Tweets, and visit thomaserandall.ca/Tom Talks. Thanks to Jeremy for joining me for this podcast, and thanks to you, the listener, for your support.